Lecture 5 is the first lecture in Module 2, which means we're two-thirds of the way and halfway through the lectures for this semester. As previous lectures, we will define the realm, define the region, look into aspects of the human geography or the specific realm. Because this lecture is very large and our textbook does not cover many aspects of physical geography, I decided not to include a physical geography section for Europe. Europe is not an exception to some of the things that we see around the world, like political instability, economic downturn, civil war, refugee crisis, economic policies that affect large groups of individuals. And in this lecture, what we will see is some of the evolution of how European Union came to be and some of the pros and cons associated with it and some of the challenges that Europe is facing currently. Europe is a beautiful place with tons of history, architecture, and landscape. As you travel through Europe, you might think there is stability or no political unrest or economic downturns. This is an image of Lisbon, Portugal. Very beautiful, lots of hills. If you ever go there, it's Mediterranean weather. The trolley is one of those landmarks they have. It's along the coast, so nice temperature. And like I said, tons of history that you're able to enjoy. But as we're going to examine more in this lecture, we'll begin to see some of the challenges that Europe face. Europe is a realm of peninsulas and islands on the western margin of the world's largest landmass, Eurasia. It contains 600 million people in 40 countries, but its territory is quite small. The European realm is bounded on the west, north, and south by the Atlantic, Arctic, and Mediterranean waters, respectively prominent tributaries. And that is one of the reasons why we're not going to discuss the physical attributes of Europe because of the 40 countries that are inside of the territory, and there's so much history and so many things going on in this part of the world. Europe is one of the most urbanized places in the world. On this map, we can see the density spread out throughout Europe with very small areas where there's not a lot of population. Those areas are usually mountainous areas. And we see that not only the distribution along the coast, but also in the middle of the continent. What we also see is large transportation networks that connect the cities, no matter how remote they might be. And the other thing is the history of Europe that has allowed it to be so developed and build large cities with that are interconnected with one another. This past summer, I was able to cross off an item from my bucket list, and that was to go to Paris with my family, and we went right after the Summer Olympics. The city is full of art and history and museums, well designed, well transportation routes, tons of architecture. One of the cool experiences that we had as a family was that we were able to participate or go to an event of the Paralympics, which I think for us was one of the highlights. But as you go to anywhere in Europe, whether it's Spain, which is a very popular destination, or Italy, or Germany, or any other place, you will see not only the history, but also the way that it has developed over the decades. Let's examine the major geographic features of Europe. The European geographic realm lies on the western flank of the Eurasian landmass. Though territorially small, Europe is heavily populated and fragmented into 40 states. Some of the states, as we're going to learn later on the lecture, have been created in the last couple of decades. Some of them are trying to break away, and there's new impending threats to that independence of those states. Third, European natural environment are highly varied, and Europe resources base is rich and diverse. Fourth, Europe geographic diversity, cultural as well as physical, created strong local identities, specializations, and opportunities for trade and commerce. We'll examine the importance of the Industrial Revolution as a consequence of the development and urbanization and population growth in Europe. The European Union is a historic and unique effort to achieve multinational economic integration, to a lesser degree, political coordination. We're going to spend a lot of time examining key terms related to the European Union, as well as some of the threats, as well as pros and cons associated with that unification. Six, Europe's relative prosperous population is highly urbanized and aging rapidly. That is one of the threats that Europe faces right now, the aging population, to the point that many places, as you probably heard, Italy is one of them, Spain has started doing that. They will pay individuals to move to very remote rural areas. They will sell houses for $1 just to get people investing and living in very rural areas. Despite Europe's efforts for unification, East and West contrasts still mark the realm regional geography, as well as, to a somewhat lesser extent, cultural differences persist between the North and the South. So if you're planning to go to Europe, Western Europe is going to be more costly, more developed. Eastern Europe will be less developed, cheaper, in many cases not even using the euro. Number eight, the influx of immigrants and refugees, which reached crisis proportion around 2015 due to the crisis of Syria, some of the things that were going in Northern Africa as well, is still testing the stability of the European Union and has caused a shift toward nationalism and populism in many European countries. What we see is a dramatic shift for just protecting national interests, very hatred and very direct policies towards migrants, just to limit the amount of individuals that are crossing the borders. Lastly, the Baltic region has become a critical geopolitical testing ground in the relationship between Europe and Russia, and we're seeing that being played out, particularly in Ukraine. Towards the end of the lecture, I will share my experience in Ukraine several years ago. Here we begin to see the extent of Europe divided into four regions: Western Europe, Northern Europe, Mediterranean Europe, and Eastern Europe. For each of these regions, we can spend a lot of time discussing the various political, cultural, economic aspects of each region. As always, we're going to try to highlight certain things as a case study just to get an idea of what's happening altogether in the realm. In the past, Europe divided rather easily into Western and Northern or Nordic states, Mediterranean South and Eastern region, and countries were grouped accordingly. This traditional configuration remains relevant even today, but in the era of European unification, a core periphery framework has been superimposed on that regional scheme, defining terms of how central or peripheral countries are to the working of the European Union. In other words, Europe can still be understood as a set of formal, more or less homogeneous cultural regions, as we've seen in the previous slides in the map, yet at the same time, the entire realm increasingly functions as a tightly interdependent economic and political regional systems, a spatial network that revolves around the European Union. We distinguish four major regions as the ones we see on this slide and on the previous map. So as we begin to think about many things that happened in Europe in the last couple of years with the Brexit of England, um, what do we do with the emerging economies, particularly in the Mediterranean, Europe, including Slovenia and Croatia, and most importantly, what's happening in Eastern Europe and the threat that exists as a boundary between Russia and the rest of Europe. Let's examine certain aspects of human geography in the European realm. Our starting point will be the impact of colonization not only in Europe but throughout the entire world. What we see is a map control by European nations between 1500 and 1950. To, by 1913, it's estimated that 84% of the Earth's mass was controlled by European superpower. This impact created this control created tons of legacies, such as the language that people speak, the religion that the people practice. Within that, created multiple conflicts between the different religions that existed in that part of the world, different cultural and aspects, such as drinking tea, for example, in India, or playing cricket in Southeast Asia, which is an import from Britain, or playing rugby in Australia. All of those were a consequences of colonization. The reason why Europe went out into expanding their territories was for access to raw material, for land and wealth, as well as controlling people. It was also a military strategic strategy to acquire territories and begin to establish cities as well as naval bases. Organization according to its object related to resource acquisition and market expansion that created political, religious, and cultural drive. Existed throughout history, a common practice of civilizations. The European colonization extended from the 1400s to 1945 after World War II. But between 1400 and 1800, we see Spain, Portugal, Holland, or the Netherlands, France, and England were the main colonial powers. After 1800, England was the only dominant colonial power out there. Colonization, as a term, is defined as an act of taking control over a territory and settling in it, often by a foreign power to establish dominance and exploit its resources. Another term that we're going to use to explain colonization is the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is the sharing of cultures that transform the lives of the entire world. So if we go back to the previous slide of all the locations and all the places on earth that European colonial powers had, it affected the entire world in the way they manage it and also they control those territories. Furthermore, the climate exchange is a two-way process with people, goods, and ideas moving back and forth. Now we're going to look at the 12 G's. So make sure you have something to write uh, the following 12 G's. I'm going to help you try to memorize them. And what we're looking at and trying to explain here is what were those things that were moving back and forth and what was the creation and how it had transformed the lives of the continents around the world. The first one, I'll call them the old G's. You probably learned them in high school somewhere. Gold, God, and glory. God, gold, and glory. The next one, to help you remember, there was a book written many years ago that had the title of Germs, Guns, and something else. But the terms that you need to remember are germs, guns, and goods. The next section, think about them as discipline or school classes that you have taken or college classes that you might be interested or subjects you might be interested in. Government, geography, and globalization. And the last one are just random that don't fit in a certain category. Gender, genocide, and grains. All right, so let me repeat all of them again. Gold, God, and glory. Germs, guns, and goods. Government, geography, and globalization. Gender, genocide, and grains. So this is an easy way to just remember the impact of colonization and the climate exchange in the world. So what was exchange? The 12 G's that we talked about. So you don't have to worry about the list here because in essence, all those things that we see in that list covers in the 12 G's. Here's a map that allows us to visualize the climate exchange as goods are being traded from one place to another. We see the animals, we see plants, we see the diseases with this, in essence, the germs. We see different aspects of nature being exchanged. But that is also significant because later on, if you see potatoes being taken from South America, which is where they're native from, to Europe, particularly to Northern Ireland in the 1800s, they had the potato famine because they only took one type of potatoes, where in South America, there's 100 different types of potatoes. So again, this gives you an idea of the climate exchange, the importance, the significance, how it impacts the entire world. I would like you to pause the lecture at this moment and see the various products and animals that are native to certain parts of the world. Again, this illustrates the power of colonization. This illustrates the power of the climate exchange. So one of the things that is fascinating to me personally is that many of the products that we consume in this side of the world, particularly things like bananas, chickens, coconuts, rice, come from Southeast Asia. So that is something I want you to remember, that bananas come from Southeast Asia, but we consume them in the United States to the extent also that in the Americas, it's one of the largest cash products that they exist. So when we move to the Mediterranean, we see certain things that they have contributed, which is not much in the overall scheme of things. So the Europeans, what they did is brought all these products to Europe and to the rest of the world, as we made them seem that they're ours now, but it has taken decades and centuries to make it such. Another impact of colonization was the forced migration and the forced labor extracted from Africa and taken into the Americas, controlled by the Europeans. Colonization and the colonial powers created the first global transnational network of trade. What we see here is called the Atlantic Slave Triangle. What we have is going raw materials from the Americas into Europe, converting them into manufacturing products, and then sending slaves or labor into the Americas. This map illustrates the trading ports, the trading routes, and the shipping lanes that were eventually created by the colonial powers, and how the world was interconnected as early as the 1700s or 1400, 1500, and so on. So when we think about globalization, we think it's a recent phenomenon, but it's not. It has been going on for hundreds of years, just very slow in terms of the transportation routes and times, but it was very effective in moving products, goods, and people across the world. We're going to move away from colonization and into a new historical time period known as the Industrial Revolution. This was developed in UK, United Kingdom, between 1750 and 1850. Technical innovations that occurred in British industry included the use of new material coming from the Americas, steel, iron, chemicals, and other products, usage of thermal energy to produce mechanical energy, the substitution of machines to human and animal labor led to production, which factories, transportation, and something else that is not there is that all of this means of productions, all the transportations brought individuals to the cities, and then the cities became humongous urban centers. Also, discoveries in medicine that enable individuals to live longer and to deal with some of the diseases at the time. This is a very good illustration of the expand of the Industrial Revolution. What the map is illustrating is that the expansion takes place along the coal and iron ore fields, which is the natural resource that is being extracted from the earth, then creating manufacturing centers that eventually turn into cities. The Industrial Revolution created urbanization and population explosion. Industrial cities became the backbone of Europe's population cluster. East to west industrial axis remain major features of European population geography even today. What we started as very simple manufacturing products turned into industrial powers and now technological centers. Again, the Industrial Revolution is the catalyst for the population explosion. So prior to that, if you go back to what we learned in lecture number 2, looking at the demographic transition model, the explosion in population in Europe and around the world took place in the Industrial Revolution because of the introduction of things like penicillin, soap, understanding how certain diseases are spread. Individuals are living longer based upon the food that they're consuming and how they're being the access to medicine they have, which led to a population explosion. That population explosion later on created its own issue, the lack of jobs, which led to migration to North America and to South America. And since the Industrial Revolution, the population has been growing exponentially really fast. So now we're roughly about 7 billion people on Earth and expected to grow to 8 billion shortly after. And that is just what we discussed, this notion of population momentum. Even though birth rates and total fertility rates might be dropping around the world, the population momentum continues into several decades when that birth rates and total fertility rates begin to decline. Although population growth and urbanization rates have begun to decline throughout Europe, there are certain cities in Europe that are having fast urbanization growth. And most of the cities are either newer or isolated from the primate cities or the historical capitals or the powerhouses of Europe. So we began to see, based upon this map, there are certain locations in Europe that are experiencing very fast urbanization growth. That could be either the establishment of new technologies or industrial or manufacturing places, or the influx of migration as well. Most of Europe's population is either living in cities or towns and suburbs near those cities, similar to the Americas or even the United States or Northern America, where most individuals live in towns or cities or in the suburbs. Very few countries and very small populations still live in the rural areas. For several decades now, Europe has had a negative natural population growth that has resulted in shrinking population and below the replacement fertility rate, which is 2.1. That also has led to impact in terms of finding work and those individuals that the labor force that does not pay enough taxes for the social services. So migration has also been the other aspect that Europe is facing with or dealing with, partially offsetting population decline, which is a positive thing, changing one's homogeneous nation state, which has resulted in conflict, has brought up anti-immigration policies as well as parties that cater to that, growth of Muslim clusters in cities and assimilated migrants. France has had issues with that as well. Spain with African migrants, restriction on migration and cultural differences, uh, maybe not learning the language quick enough, or the culture is very different, and that has created strains. Massive influx of political economic migrants from Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, and some of the other aspects that we've seen in the news, demonstrations against the immigration policies or the amount of immigrants that are arriving, or some of the other news that we've seen, some of the terrorist attacks that have taken place in many of these European cities have also created major issues. One of the interesting things about Europe is the amount of languages that it has, but it also has regional language that many of us don't even realize. One of my surprises was when I went to Barcelona many years ago. I speak Spanish, I speak English. What has surprised me is that they don't even most of the signage in the main languages they speak is not even Spanish; it's Catalan, and they're very proud of that fact. So there are other parts of Europe that is the same aspect where there is a traditional or what is called lingua franca, the official language, but there's subsets languages inside the country as well. It is worth remembering that Europe's territory is just over 60% the size of the United States, but that population of Europe's 40 countries almost twice as large as America's. This population of just under 600 million speaks numerous languages, almost all of which belong to the Indo-European language family. So there's not a cohesive language that is spoken throughout Europe, but there are many languages, which creates its own problems in terms of how do you create a cohesive political and economic structure like the European Union. Conflicts in the Middle East or Africa would drive millions of individuals out their homes looking for better opportunities. And some of the places or nearby places that get affected are areas like Europe. The Syrian refugee crisis of 2015 and 2016, more than 6 million internally migrants were displaced within Syria. Over 4.8 million are refugees outside of Syria, more than 6.1 according to the United Nations. 2.7 million moved to Turkey, 1.5 million to Lebanon, and 2.5 million to Saudi Arabia. 10 moved to Europe, including half a million in Germany. Part over a wider refugee perspective from Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. That has led to instability in Northern Africa and the Middle East, has opened new smuggle routes into Europe. Conflicts around the world has created both a legal and illegal stream of individuals trying to arrive to safer, more prosperous areas, particularly like Europe. So this is a table that you see the growth of the asylum applications It doesn't mean that individuals are going to be granted asylum or refugee protection to enter Europe. But the idea is that as conflict are near Europe, Europe is seen as a safe route, similar to what happens in Latin America, that the United States will get the influx of migration. The larger the circle means that there are more refugees there. And I believe for every large circle that you see, that has also created a political crisis that has brought either very extreme right governments into power to deal with the migration crisis that the countries are experiencing or think they're experiencing. And that has led to issues or maybe like thinking that this might be a period of time that you go back to after World War II with how the Germans and the Hitler and the Nazi Party began to um, scapegoat the Jews and then put them in concentration camps. Now, again, Europe has had a long history with discrimination and treating individuals from other parts of the world very poorly, and this is just a continuation of that. So here are several routes that individuals will use. Some of them are really just about proximity, particularly the one in North Africa to Spain. You cross literally into Spain either by boats. But the one that was more on the news was the Syrian migrants going through Greece via boats through Turkey and then trying to get into the European Union. Once they get into the European Union, it's very easy to move across borders just because there is no checkpoints. In the next slides, we're going to be introducing a lot of key terms. If you want further explanation, you can always use a textbook to read upon some of the examples. I'll try to do my best to simplify them and give you examples that you can relate to. So we're going to be looking at various terms in relationship to European unification or the European Union. How did these countries came together and what are some of the factors that brought them? So some of the forces that we're going to be looking at is this notion of centrifugal forces. Centrifugal forces contribute to social and political divergence that may break up states. In other words, what things are driving away as opposed to unifying certain regions. Centripetal forces help to politically unify a cohesive and stable entity. Things like treaty agreements, political or economic agreements that will bring unification. So those two forces are constantly working against each other, particularly in Europe. European integration unification has created very triumphant centripetal forces proceeded especially after World War II, and some of the efforts that have created stability and prosperity and even security even now in 2025. Europe has had many times in their history unification attempts, but also opportunities to break up or create tension, whether it's World War One, World War II, and various events throughout. So the primary motive of this unification was a rapid post-war economic recovery program, specifically led by the United States. This is where we created institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, United Nations were created with the rebuilding of Europe, reopening European markets for U.S. goods, securing Europe as a buffer against former Russia or former Soviet Union. European political consideration was created. Close political cooperation was necessary for peace, but also unification as a process of recovery, but also as a protection of future threats. The fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall in 1989 created reunification efforts, particularly with West and East Germany in 1990, but it led to the division of the Czech Republic into two countries in 1993, and then eventually the collapse of Yugoslavia into seven countries in 1989 and 1992. Then the motive began to change as additional threats, as a globalization economy begins to take hold. Europe begins to ask themselves, how can we better situate it for a global economy when we're competing against the United States and Asia, and that is when they began to have discussions about the European Union. Try to maintain stability in an increasingly diverse society has been extremely challenging. As we discussed, there are 40 countries with sub-regions inside of it, and then individuals speaking multiple languages and different points of view in terms of how to deal with certain threats like migration or economic downturn, unemployment, inflation, natural disasters, security. You're probably too young to remember some of the wars, particularly in Serbia and Macedonia and Kosovo, uh, and they were all fueled by religious divisions. Yugoslavia was a former Soviet Union satellite that eventually won the independence from Russia, and then eventually they began to fight for their own freedom, which led to a bloody war, um, tons of issues in the 1990s and eventually 2000 that continues even today. So the Balkan region of Europe is an area that we have to continue to be thinking about just because the tension is not hidden. It's on top of the surface. Anything can spark another ethnic cleansing like it took place previously, or any political tension that could exist. Even areas like Kosovo is actually not even recognized as a sovereign state because they believe that it's still a part of Serbia. So Serbia and Macedonia would not recognize Kosovo. So this just gives you some of the attention. I'm actually planning a trip to go to Albania, potentially Kosovo and Macedonia in September. So it'll be my first time in that part of the world and understanding some of the difficulties as it relates to multiple religions, multiple language, multiple ethnicities in that part of the world. When we get to Asia, we'll spend a lot more time thinking about conflict, ethnic conflict, what creates ethnic conflict. But here is just a very quick preview. Some of the conflicts around the world is just the fact that you are from a very different ethnic background. That ethnic background creates an identity, that identity creates a conflict, and that conflict leads to potential war or tension between individuals that live nearby one another. So Yugoslavia was just capturing all of that in one particular region that lived multiple ethnic groups, and eventually, maybe the best illustration is like a pressure cooker. It just keeps building up, and when eventually it explodes, then you have this result of breakup of the countries into various states that eventually they try to build their own economy, and that has been very difficult, particularly for the Balkan region. So let's examine the unification process of Europe. Number one, agreements on free trade across boundaries without tariffs or border controls. Two, the abolition of protectionist economic policy, meaning that you can no longer just protect certain parts of the economy, but eliminate those restrictions to facilitate trade. Number three, harmonize natural laws, example taxations, to establish a level playing field. And this is where it got really complicated. You have 40 countries or 28 countries that were coming into the European Union, each of them at a different economic level. And how do you level the playing field for lesser economic countries versus higher economic countries? And that took a long time to discuss and to come with an agreement. So the traditional superpowers or the traditional powers of Europe, particularly in the West, were better prepared to come into European Union. And what they ended up doing was that European or countries that were trying to enter the European Union, they had to achieve certain thresholds, lower inflation, lower certain currency aspects, eliminate certain trade restrictions, create certain unemployment or employment opportunities. So this just gives you the idea, right, that it was very difficult to create this process. So European Union directives were aimed at the creation of a single market for producers, consumers, and businesses and workers. Corporations should be able to produce and sell anywhere within the Union without legal impediments, whereas workers should be able to move anywhere in the European Union and find employment without legal restriction. This was also another very difficult point where you have lesser economies or migrants or workers coming from that area, particularly from Eastern Europe, coming into places like Britain and Germany and France. In order to keep things manageable, member states have had to harmonize a wide range of national laws, from either taxation to the protection of the environment, to create educational standards. For political cooperation and the creation of pan-European executive, judicial, and legislative bodies, I believe that Brussels is the house or the center for the European Union legislature, and different parts of Europe will house either the judicial or other aspects of the European Union. Fifth, the introduction of a single currency, the euro. And lastly, an agreement to transfer specific power from national governments to European institutions. And this was a very difficult point to achieve. Some of these terms are already used earlier in the lecture, but I'm going to try to define them now. When we think about a nation is a group of people who share a common culture, history, language, or identity, often but not always residing within a specific geographical region. In other words, this is a group of individuals that are not necessarily a country or a state. And I know that gets some confusing. The best example I can give you is, think about in the United States, the Navajo or the Cherokee Nation, right? It's a group of individuals that share a common history, language, and heritage, but are not necessarily a country, right? That's a nation. The Kurds in Europe and in the Middle East is also another example that they do not have a sovereign state. A state is a political entity with a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to govern its people and territory independently. In other words, it's not only a legal jurisdiction, but is recognized internationally as such. So think about the United States as a country that is a state. Think about Spain, that is a state, right? Think about Saudi Arabia, that is a state. That idea of legality is important versus a nation that is not recognized legally. And sovereignty is the term controlling power and influence over a territory, especially by the government that is autonomous state over the people it rules. In other words, it has the ability to govern. That is the biggest difference between a state and a nation. A nation does not have sovereignty, does not have power, and does not have control to govern its people. This is the first time I read or learned about this term. Supranationalism is a venture involving three or more states, political, economic, and cultural cooperation to promote a shared objective. And this is where the European Union comes in. So every time we think about European Union, it's a classic example of supranationalism. The idea of a voluntary association in economic, political, and cultural spheres of independent states willing to yield some measure of sovereignty for the mutual benefit. Again, put in parentheses the European Union as an example of supranationalism. This notion of integration has in no small part being a matter of steady institution building. So little by little creating this supernatural regional jurisdiction. Schengen, I think it's a German term. Again, it's my first time reading about that. Is a territory constituted by most of European countries where people are free to cross international boundaries without a formal border or check. I have a map that I will load up so you can kind of see that visually. Where is this region? So these are the individuals that have created some type of unity, and this is where it gets really complicated in terms of European Union. Some members are members, some are affiliated, some in the process of it. The European zone, or the Eurozone, has 19 countries as of late of 2019 whose official currency is the euro. Again, many levels of complexity to the European Union. So if you're in the Eurozone, you have the currency of the euro. But most of Eastern Europe does not have the euro as a currency. They're in the process of being adopted or brought into the European Union. Lastly, NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance that was constituted or created after World War II. It right now has 32 members from Europe and North America. And the whole idea is to promote a collective security and defended members against aggression. So this is where Ukraine comes in, because Ukraine, even though it's part of the European Union, is not part of NATO. And NATO states that if you attack one of the members of NATO, you attack everyone else. So Ukraine has been lobbying for them to be part of the NATO, so that way they will have protection. Again, it's not that easy, but that is the idea, right? If you attack a NATO country like Poland, then you're attacking all of NATO and the United States. This might be a term that you've probably heard before, Brexit. On Thursday, 23rd of June 2016, the British electorate voted to leave the European Union, and the decision was very close. The final outcome was 52 to 48. Just over 9 months later, on the 29th of March of 2017, Prime Minister Theresa May triggered Article 50, marking the start of the 2 years of negotiation to trash out Britain's deal for its exit from the European Union. Why would Britain decide to leave the European Union? There were two main factors. Number one, economic policies and migration policies that were the reason that the politicians sold to the people of Britain to get out of the European Union. So NATO right now is in the news. The current president, President Trump, is forcing whether we withdraw from NATO or withdraw assistance or economic assistance from NATO, arguing that NATO does not pay enough in terms of military and economic contribution. But the NATO, nevertheless, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has had its function in preventing powerful countries like Soviet Union to do whatever they want. So right now is this tension, this very we're living in it, right? This tension of what is the role of NATO? How do we or NATO controls Soviet Union and their desire for expansionism, right? Expanding, and how do we protect the members of NATO, which in essence have agreed all to defend? So some of the biggest issues that NATO and other alliances similar to that is terrorism, right? The threat of terrorism, rogue states or states that have a very personal agenda or country agenda to expand their territory. Cyber war is a humongous one. Natural resources, we hear on the news constantly about Europe or Russia controlling the pipelines for gas and petroleum, and Ukrainians selling the rights for mining sectors to the United States, and we, the United States, want to buy those. All this is playing out right now. So Europe traditionally has not been front and center in terms of the news, but right now, in this time of period that we're living in, Europe is right in front and center. So that's why we're spending a lot of time in Europe as a lecturer, as a class, to learn more. Remember that NATO was formed right after World War II to create security for Europe as a result of World War II. And in essence, what they were doing, they were trying to protect themselves from an additional threat. And that threat at that time was Russia. So the original founding members were Italy, France, United Kingdom, Norway, Denmark, Portugal, and the United States. Then after 1949, you see what we know today as the rest of Europe joining, including Turkey, which is a very interesting decision, and the potential candidates that are being negotiated as a result of some of the threats that Russia is representing to this part of the world. So here's the terms that we just used before: the Schengen area, which is the traditional heart of the European Union. Members that are part of the Schengen or this part of this collaboration, but not necessarily European members, and European members that are not part of the Schengen. So again, very complicated. Europe as a region, as a realm, has all these moving pieces, right? Some of them have adopted the euro as the currency. Some of them have decided not to. And then in the most recent timeline has been Britain or United Kingdom deciding to leave European Union was shocking. Maybe that is an outlier. Maybe that is a norm that we're going to see in the future. I believe personally that we're going to have more individual countries, particularly the Baltic states, the former Yugoslavia countries, trying to join the European Union because there's a lot of benefits in terms of migration as well as economic advantages to join the European Union. So, what are some consequences of unification attempts in terms of economic one market? One of the benefits is the free movement of workers and goods, require harmonization of member state laws, so creating a similar policy for all the members, reduce legal barriers and remove internal borders, facilitates trade across space, movement of goods and people. The introduction of a single bank and currency, in this case the euro, it was agreed in 1999 to lock exchange rates, and banknotes introduced on January 1st, 2002. And the euro has been stronger than the dollar for many, many decades. I think a couple years ago was the exception where it was almost 1 to 1. But traditionally, the euro has been a more stronger currency than the dollar. Signal strength and unity in Europe, again, by having one currency, provides a whole bunch of benefits, helps to encounter the global power of the United States dollar. It challenges, actually, the power of the United States dollar for investment and banking. 17 of the European Union member states have acquired or have agreed to use the euro. Some member states chose to opt out. England, Sweden, Denmark, and Poland continues to use their own currency. So again, tons of moving parts. You're not expected to know everything, but just know that the European Union unification has been a very long process with many difficulties. Here's another map just looking at the current Eurozone. So if you're traveling to Europe, just know that the euro will be your default currency for most of the Western Europe. But once you start moving into Eastern Europe, it will be they're not going to use the euro, which make it more beneficial for you as an American traveler, as a tourist, because you can get a better exchange rate. So the effects of the unification has affected and created a new economic geography with zones, has reduced the effects of natural boundaries. Some subnational regions have become powerful engine of growth. Here are four: the Rhone-Alps region, the Lombardy region, the Catalonia region, and the Baden-Württemberg region that all have blossomed as a result of the European Union. So the consequence of this unification has created policies of subsidies, the development of less prosperous subregions, common agricultural policies known as CAP, and farmers, system of tariffs, quotas, and subsidies for agricultural production. Some of them have benefited locally. They have created protection for certain things, like they have, I think the terminology is, if you're the country of origin, for example, Bordeaux, right, the Bordeaux region that produces champagne or certain types of wine, you are protected, right? If you are in Italy and you produce a certain type of cheese, you're protected. If you are Spain and you're producing the ham, Serrano ham, you're protected, right? The idea is to protect certain farmers and certain practices under the cultural heritage. Uneven development, major differences persist between regions and within member states. So again, this notion of discrepancy, inequality, supranationalism problems, loss of autonomy, notably over currency and migration, disparities in levels of economic development, technical barriers, additional levels of bureaucracy, which no one likes, cultural barriers. It may lead to devolutionary pressures, meaning getting out, right? Which in essence was the result of the United Kingdom deciding to get out of the European Union because it was no longer favorable for the members or the country as a whole. So devolution is a term or a process whereby regions within a state demand and gain political strength and growing autonomy at the expense of the central government. So there are regions, as we stated before, they're trying to break away. They're asking for independence. There was a major march that took place in Barcelona, the region of Catalonia, which has their own language, demanding for independence and more freedom. There are other, here the map shows you, there are other places on Europe that are requiring or demanding less control over the central government and more freedom by the regional governments. So these centrifugal forces or regions or people within a state that demand and gain political strength at the expense of the state can lead to chaos, unrest, and potential civil war. The evolution results when absolute sovereignty of the state over its territory erodes. So again, this notion of states versus nation versus regions versus individual people, right? They demand the freedom. States respond in a way of multiple ways, from suppression to accommodation to eventually threats, maybe sending in military forces. So central states, central governments are trying to respond in various ways to some of the pressures that they're facing in terms of the devolutionary pressures. One way is to deal with the centrifugal forces to give historical regions such as Scotland or Catalonia in Spain certain rights and privileges formerly held exclusively by the national government. Another answer is for the European Union and member states to create a new administrative division that will allow the states to meet regional demands, often in consultation with or under pressure from the European Union. Again, European Union is trying to maintain the unity, the years and decades of efforts to have a cohesive union, but there's always pressures arising throughout Europe. So Europe has to make a decision. Do they continue to expand or continue to construct, depending on the pressures that they're facing? So, widening the expanding of the membership of the European Union. Difficulties include an uneven economy, desperate political system, and greater cultural diversity. The Copenhagen criteria, eligibility for European membership, stability, democracy, rule of law, market economy, those have been the benchmarks for a country to come into the European Union. Negotiations with potential members such as the Balkans, Europe Far East, including Turkey as well. Cultural distinction could impede membership. So there's a lot of tension, in particular in these meetings, in terms of creating a homogeneous or a very unified front as the European Union decides to either increase membership to the European Union or to halt or to begin to kick out certain countries. Greece, for example, has tested the European Union results from an economic perspective when I think it was in 2000 when they defaulted on their loans. And that created a bailout. Britain, the United States, and other countries came out to support and to help out Greece to get out of their economic blunders and decisions. Deepening is the intensified policies and laws of the European Union. This is very difficult in maintaining and creating uniform laws. Rising Euroscepticism and public resistance to deepening or the involvement of a central state in local affairs, which resulted in the United Kingdom voted to exit the European Union in 2016, as is known as the Brexit. So this is where the tension is. How much and how more powerful, how much control do you give the European Union and the laws that are going to affect individuals' countries? And as we think about widening or deepening or unifying or leaving, you have to think about external factors as well. What is going on around the world? High unemployment rates, skyrocketing national debts, Eurozone bailouts, the Greek debt crisis, which I just mentioned before, social political consequences, the polarization of national politics is very difficult for European or creates difficulties for European Union to continue their activities. What are the benefits? Are the benefits enough to continue to create a unified approach? What happens when unskilled, unemployed migrants drive negative economic indicators and become the scapegoats either from poorer countries in Eastern Europe migrating to Western Union countries, or migrants from North Africa or the Middle East flooding European Union? So all this is creating massive tension in Europe. So maybe within your lifetime, maybe in the next 10 years or a decade or a couple years from now, the question will be, do we support European Union or we oppose it? Right? What are the pros and cons of having such a powerful union? Is that a model that other countries and other regions of the world should continue to emulate or follow, or it was a mistake? We don't know. Time will tell. So for the last part of this lecture, I just want to show you and highlight some of my experience in Ukraine. Just to give you a background story, in 2014, Russian-backed militants seized towns and cities in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region and proclaimed the Donetsk People Republic and the Luhansk People Republic as independent states, starting the Donbas War. So that is near Crimea, where you see that red on the bottom of the map. On February 24th, 2022, surprise to everyone, Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which was started back in 2014. The invasion was the largest and most deadliest conflict in Europe since World War II, has caused hundreds of thousands of military casualties and tens of thousands of Ukrainian civil casualties. You've probably seen the news and seen some of the images. Now, one of the latest changes in the war is North Korean military personnel as well as weapons being engaged, particularly on the Ukrainian conflict, right, with Russia. So where I was able to travel to Ukraine back in 2023 in September, I wanted to go a year prior, but it was very difficult to get there. But I finally was able to contact friends and that worked in the region and was able to go. So we arrived to Romania, the Cluj region, and I'll show you a map of that. And then you see how large Ukraine is. In essence, where you see the map Moldova, we drove through the entire country from Romania all the way to where you see Izium on the right-hand side of the map. And eventually we arrived to the Donetsk region, which is the front line. And we actually were able to bring relief to villages along the front line. We got as close as 15 kilometers from the front line of the war and about 2 hours from Russia. I travel so much for work and for various reasons that it's very hard to remember every place that I've been to, all the length of drive. But for this particular trip, it was really memorable because we flew into Cluj, which is where our contacts were. Then they drove us 7 hours to the border with Ukraine, entered through there. There was no issues with being Americans into that part on the left hand side of the map. There was very surreal. There was people eating and universities open, people walking in the streets, so they were not affected by the war at all. So this is a region where a lot of the migrants or the displaced people from the war have made home, just because they're home in Crimea or the Donetsk region or the Luhansk region were affected, so they moved into the interior of the country. So we drove roughly about 24, 28 hours, 26 hours, can't remember, across Ukraine, stopping at various locations, contacting different individuals. I wanted to go to Kiev, and when I asked our team leader, why are we not going to Kiev, he's like, what's in Kiev? Meaning there's nothing going on there. So that was another bubble of safety in Kiev. Obviously, the war has escalated since 2023 when I've been there. But the notion was, there are other regions in Ukraine that are more affected by the war. And again, you've probably seen that in the news. So we drove, again, just to summarize the trip, landed in Romania, drove 7 hours to the border, and from the border into Ukraine, we drove all the way to Donetsk. So literally, we drove in the entire country to get to the front line. So one of the interesting things, like I said, the city that we were, the nearest largest city near the Romanian border, it's a university town. People are studying, they're eating, they're walking in the middle of the night, and that scene changed as we were moving into Ukraine, closer to the front line. Lack of electricity, tanks, buildings destroyed, only older people living in the cities. You barely see children, no men of military age, very few women. very surreal, right? How quickly a country can change demographically during a war. And then this is what Ukraine has when you go into different cities. You will have this little monument. There's a monument. I don't even know if I have it. When we're entering, that is the dividing line between the war zone and not war zone, meaning that this is where you're entering the war zone. So heads up. So we stopped, took pictures there, and it was full of bullet holes, just to highlight some of the war fighting that was taking place there. The gentleman that we went with, um, he is Romanian. He's a plumber. He has a heart to help the Ukrainian people. So his entire passport is filled with entry points or entry stamps into Ukraine. He goes probably twice a month or more than that, because it's 7 hours, so he feels like it's nothing. For me, it was a very dangerous up mountains, down mountains, very dangerous roads driving through the night. But then I think once a month he goes all the way to the front line. So he has an entire network of connections and people that he knows. Very nice gentleman. We're still in contact even to this day, trying to understand some of the updates of the war. So here's some images from the war. Uh, One of the things that we did was raise money to combine boxes or create boxes to drop at various locations, churches, nonprofits, villages, people that we knew or they knew. We took 3 vans full of boxes, about 900 boxes of food, distributed throughout various places. So that was one of the primary goals of my trip there. Bullet holes everywhere. One of the saddest parts were going into villages, deep into the front line area, where very you can tell it was very affluent at one point. Resort near a lake, very beautiful homes, completely destroyed, bullet holes, deserted. No one lives there. This is a soldier in a region near the front line that we drove to. It was just myself, not my entire team. They told me about the dangers going into this particular area. There was no electricity, dark, complete darkness. So we're meeting with him, give him boxes of food, give him a couple of things. We give him lollipops. We found out the lollipops is one of the greatest gift of humanity. Let me explain that. Why? So along the checkpoints, because there were so many checkpoints, um, we took lollipops to give out to kids. But then my contact asked me, like, do you have, how many lollipop boxes do you have? And I was like, I don't know, 6, 8. So each box brings 680 lollipops, whatever it was. So at every checkpoint that we stopped, that soldiers asked us, where are you from? Where are you coming? Give us your passport. What are you doing here? We just give them lollipops, and their face completely changed. They turn into children, right? Like this, a smile, innocence, almost like a relief from the war. So we learned really quickly that lollipop, as simple as a lollipop, was a great tool to connect with them in a human aspect, but also bring them relief. So this soldier that they knew because they were from the village that they grew up, he was explaining us the horror of war and how tired they were, the trauma they were facing, the conditions they were living in, because the Ukrainian army is not able to replenish their army as quickly as the Russians. The soldiers, the veteran soldiers, they fight, I think, 3 continuous days without sleep fighting, right? So you're just pulling a trigger because the Russians have created a system called the meat grinder where they send thousands of soldiers to overrun the positions by the Ukrainian soldiers, maybe just 3 or 4 holding the line with machine guns to try to exhaust them or kill them. So you could tell really quickly that this soldier was his nerves were shot, right? He was really anxious, holding his arms, rubbing his arms. You can kind of tell there was a lot of trauma there from the things that he was telling us and experiencing that he has experienced during the war. Some of these pictures are from individuals that we talked to. The individuals that allowed us, they were kind of like our chaperones, were chaplains, chaplains working with soldiers in the front line. So there were our escorts to get into the near the front line. So we spent about 3 hours with them, telling us all the things that they had witnessed, the amount of horror stories and traumas and soldiers, and just constantly, like, just outpouring of their hearts to us and just explaining the difficulties of war. This is coming out of the front line. This is a very famous building. This was a building that was struck by a missile. I think it was in the middle of the night. You can see it was cut by half. Some of the weird scenes that we saw was that behind one of the buildings there's a uh, like a memorial erected with pictures, teddy bears. There's an image I show you, I think, at the beginning of the introductory, which is the opposite of this building. That you can kind of see life and death. There's a TV. You can see clothing is still there. One of our team members went inside the building, took pictures of it. Here's one of the cities nearby the front line that we were giving food. 300 people will come in, we'll give food. The scary thing was that 3 months after we left there, we got a video where a bomb landed on that same stage that I was in, uh, and then it destroyed the theater. But underneath the theater, what was interesting is that the women are left behind, elderly women. They're telling their stories about leaving their homes, children serving on the war. But underneath this theater, they're actually doing camouflage for soldiers, snipers, vehicles, buildings, and there's an entire war effort just building. So this lady was kind enough for us to take pictures, to hear her story. Um, it was very heartfelt, just seeing all these ladies just working towards the war effort. So we would enter the front line, and we were entering where the devastation of the war, particularly around February in the preceding month, and then the Ukrainians pushed them back, right, to the current state where they are. Just the amount of destruction, missiles, guns, and bullet holes. So these are some of the images. Just know that you're not supposed to take pictures. But I've been around enough that I'm comfortable taking pictures and restricted areas and things like that. So here are some pictures that could have got me in trouble, but it's to share. So these are camouflage. Remember the ladies working on the camouflage. So this is what they're being used. All the cars by the Ukrainian army either are confiscated, private vehicles painted in green to camouflage it. Uh, Humvees, tanks have the same camouflage. Some of the bunkers that were run for miles on end along sunflower fields. This is kind of like slowed down the tank invasion. Some of the shots there in terms of the guns and the bullets going through, heavy ammunition. The building destructions, the building that we crossed with temporary. There were times that we were sitting in traffic for like minutes, like 10, 20, 30 minutes, waiting for either tanks to pass by in the middle of the day. And I'm thinking, you know, why isn't the Russians not attacking us or attacking that? We also were, they told us part of the threat or some of the threats that we could experience was the fact that the Russians were targeting NGOs and volunteers. They actually were targeting to kill them. So drones were a constant fear. The zone that we went into, one of the villages where we gave food, we needed to have bulletproof vests and lead helmets, which cost $10,000. None of us had it. And definitely, I don't think American citizens have ever gone there. We were lucky to get in there and lucky to get out. When we were coming down that hill, there was gunfires and mortars being shelled out from the Ukrainian side to the Russian. But luckily enough, there was no incoming shelling from the Russian side into the Ukrainian side while we were there. So that's kind of like a highlight or some of the pictures I want to share. I mean, I had thousands of pictures, just picked a couple of them, so you kind of see, right? Maybe some of the stuff that you're not seeing in the news, or seeing the destruction and seeing the costs associated with the war as Russia tries to expand its territory or reclaim all territory.